This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Friends, yesterday I spoke a few words about the significance of our threefold salutation with which we begin all our meetings. The salutation to the Buddha, salutation to the Dharma, salutation to the Sangha. And these three, the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, they constitute what we call in Buddhism the three jewels, or the three most precious things, the three highest, the three greatest, the three most ultimate values. So Buddhism is concerned mainly with these, Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, enlightenment, path to enlightenment, community of people following the path to enlightenment, and Buddhism revolves mainly around these three things. Now, yesterday evening, we considered the question, who was the Buddha? So we've learned something about the first of these three jewels, the Buddha. And this morning, therefore, I want to come on to the second of these three jewels and consider something about the Dharma. And once again, I must ask our older, more regular members to bear in mind that we are considering in this short series of talks the needs and requirements of those who are new to our movement, rather than the needs and requirements of those who have been with us a long time. At the same time, we always do recognize that to recapitulate, or to revise, to refresh our memories, is always a very good thing. It's sometimes strange, as I know myself, you go over some old familiar text, and you find a verse, a very important, a very striking verse, which somehow you do not seem to have ever noticed before. So there's no harm in revision, no harm in recapitulation. I remember in this connection once, my old friend in Kalimpong, Mr. Chen, the Chinese Buddhist yogi, told me that in his younger days when he was a student monk, he went through the entire canon in Chinese 3 times, very, very carefully, studying it by himself, also with a teacher, sutra by sutra. And there are more than 1,600 sutras in the Chinese canon. He went through the whole thing 3 times, and he thought he knew it quite well. But some years later, he said, one of his teachers, in the course of instruction, said, for such and such point, you should refer to the Great Dragon Sutra. It's one of the most important in the entire canon. So he thought back, but he couldn't remember having read a word about the Great Dragon Sutra. And he thought, well, he couldn't help even doubting the teacher a bit. And he thought, well, is there such a sutra? I don't remember it. I read it 3 times. 3 times I've gone through that canon. I don't remember any Great Dragon Sutra. Didn't say anything to the teacher. He kept his doubts to himself. But he thought, well, the teacher says it's one of the most important in the whole canon. How could I have missed it? So he said quietly in the evening, he went back to his row of volumes of the canon, turned over the pages. Sure enough, there it was, the Great Dragon Sutra. It had been there all the time, and he couldn't remember having read it. And he said this surprised him very much, this experience. But this is the sort of thing that we do find. It may be reading about the life of the Buddha. Sometimes when I propose speaking about the life of the Buddha, I can almost hear our friends groan, as if to say, well, do we need to go over that elementary stuff all over again? We know that the Buddha left home when he was 29, and we know he sat under that Bodhi tree, and we know that he did austerities for 6 years, and we know that his chief disciples were Sariputta and Moggallana. Do we have to go over it all again? But sometimes we do need, because there are all sorts of not only facts but significant connections and occurrences and implications which we miss. And I know in my own case, though I have gone over some Buddhist scriptures and teachings time and time again, but every time I come to speak about them, I find there's something new to discover, something new to appreciate, some fresh angle, some fresh aspect that we hadn't considered before. So let us not mind, therefore, not only for the benefit of newcomers, even perhaps for our own benefit, going back to fundamental things, revising, recapitulating, and refreshing. So let's come on, therefore, this morning to that well-worn topic, the Dharma, the meaning of the Dharma, the second of the three jewels, the second of the three refuges. Now let me say right away that this word Dharma is a very difficult one. It's quite untranslatable. There's no one English word by which we can render this word Dharma. So it's rather difficult to simplify here. If we go through the Buddhist scriptures, if we go through the sutras, we find that the word Dharma is used in a number of quite different senses. I think we can say that in the Buddhist scriptures there are 5 principal meanings of the word Dharma, each of which shades, as it were, into every other meaning. So let's begin, let's lay a groundwork, as it were, by considering these 5 principal meanings of the word Dharma in the Buddhist tradition, in the Buddhist scriptures. First of all, Dharma means thing. Thing. A phenomenon, if you like, to use more sophisticated, more philosophical language, but just think in general, a Dharma. Usually, in translations, we find that when the word Dharma has this meaning, it's printed with, in English, a small d. You may remember that in the Dhammapada there's a very famous verse, all things are anatta. All things are devoid of separate self. So the word which is used here for things in the original is dharma or dhamma. All dhammas are devoid of self. So here the word is dharma and it means things. All things are devoid of separate self, of real individuality. So the first of these 5 principal meanings of the word dharma is simply thing in general, a phenomenon, anything, whether it's mental, whether it's physical, whether it's spiritual, transcendental, a dharma, a thing, an ultimate element of existence, as it were. Then secondly, dharma means a mental object, an object of mind. In the West, we usually speak of 5 senses. But the Indian tradition, including the Buddhist tradition, speaks of 6 senses and their respective sense objects. There's, of course, the eye. Its object is form, not matter, but form, rupa. There is the ear, its object is sound. The nose, its object is smells. And so on for the rest of the physical senses. And then, in Buddhism, there comes mind. And its object is, we would say, idea. But in Pali and Sanskrit, it's dharma, another meaning of the word dharma. Dharma in the sense of an object of mind, a mental object. If you like, a presentation to consciousness. This is another meaning of the word dharma. You notice, incidentally, that the mind, this is the ordinary, workaday mind, the mind that we're using most of the time, not our absolute mind or transcendental consciousness, but our ordinary mind, is put on the same level as the 5 senses. In the West, we tend to think of the 5 senses here, and the mind, even the ordinary mind, up there, but not in Buddhism. In Buddhism, they're all on the same level. There's your ear, your eye, your nose, your tongue, your skin and your mind. Mind is on the same level. So the object of mind, idea, is Dharma. Another meaning of this term. Then thirdly, Dharma means a state or condition of existence. In Buddhism, there's a very famous expression or term, the 8 loka dharmas. Loka means worldly. Dharma here means condition. And these loka dharmas, therefore, are the 8 worldly conditions, or if you like, vicissitudes, archetypal pairs of opposites, and they are gain and loss, fame and infamy, blame and praise, and pleasure and pain. These are known as the 8 worldly conditions or states, these pairs of opposites, and we're asked, of course, to be indifferent to them. And therefore it says in the Mangala Sutta that the greatest of all blessings is the blessing of having a mind, a consciousness, which cannot be touched, which cannot be disturbed by any of these 8 loka dhammas, these worldly conditions. Unmoved, whether we gain or whether we lose. Unmoved, whether we're famous or whether we're infamous. Whether people blame us or whether they praise us. In the midst of pleasure, in the midst of pain. Unmoved. So these 8, and there are many such pairs, of course, not just 8. These are known as the 8 loka dharmas. So here, dharma means a state or a condition, a worldly state, a worldly condition, which is one of a pair of opposites. So another important meaning of the word dharma. You can begin to see how rich in meaning the term is, and how careful you have to be in studying the original texts, how careful you have to be to sort out the right meaning of the word dharma if you are to make sense of that particular passage. Then fourthly, dharma in the sense of law or principle or truth. As when, say, the Dhammapada says, Nahi verena verani, samantita kudachanang, averena samanti, esa dhammo sanantano, which means hatred never ceases by hatred. Hatred ceases only by love. This is an eternal dharma. Here dharma means rule or law or principle. It's in the very nature of things. So far as the human world is concerned, that hatred does not cease by hatred. Hatred ceases only by non-hatred, only by love. This is the principle, this is the law. Or if you like, this is the truth, a psychological and a spiritual principle. So this is another most important meaning of this word dharma, a psychological and a spiritual law or regulative norm of existence, or spiritual principle, whatever you might like to call it. Then, fifthly, dharma in the sense of doctrine and teaching. As when we say the Buddha Dharma. This means the doctrine of the Buddha, the teaching of the Buddha. This connotation, this sense of the word, can't very easily be rendered into English. Dharma, in this sense, is not quite doctrine in the theological, creedal sense. It's not quite teaching. It's more like a sort of exposition, or making clear, a clarification, a presentation. And we often speak in Pali and Sanskrit of Dharma Deshana, which means exposition of the Dharma, or talking about the Dharma, and so on. So this is the 5th of these 5 most important meanings of the word Dharma. That is to say, Dharma in the first place, in the first case as a thing in general, Dharma as a mental object, an object of mind, Dharma as a state or condition of mundane existence, Dharma as a law, a principle or a truth, and Dharma as a doctrine, as a teaching, something expounded. Now, when we say the Dharma, and when in English we put Dharma with a capital D, when we're thinking in terms of the second of the three jewels, or second of the three refuges, it's the last two meanings of the term which we have in mind, even though the other meanings are also there in the background. When we say the Dharma, we mean Dharma in the sense of law, principle, truth, and also Dharma in the sense of doctrine, Dharma in the sense of teaching. Where the Dharma is concerned, these are the two primary meanings. Dharma as truth, law, principle, reality, Dharma as doctrine, Dharma as teaching. So these two primary meanings. And these two, and this is very important, these two are closely connected when we speak of the Dharma. They're two aspects of the same thing, as it were. The first, Dharma as truth, or law, or principle, or reality, represents the Buddha's experience of enlightenment beneath the Bodhi tree. Because the content of that experience, what we may call its objective content, its ultimate content, was just this same law, or truth, or principle, or reality behind the universe. And the second, that is Dharma as doctrine, as teaching, represents the Buddha's expression of this content of his enlightenment in terms of thought and in terms of speech for the benefit of all living beings. So from this we can see how closely these two primary meanings of the word Dharma are connected. Dharma as the content of the Buddha's spiritual experience, Dharma as truth, reality, law, principle, and Dharma as teaching or doctrine, the expression in terms of thought and speech of the inner content of that spiritual realization, that enlightenment. So Dharma as experience on the one hand, as it were, Dharma as expression on the other hand. Experience corresponds more to the wisdom aspect of enlightenment, and expression more to the compassion aspect. And wisdom and compassion, as we know, are the twin pillars of the whole edifice of Buddhism, as Dr. D.T. Suzuki calls them. From our point of view, we can distinguish between experience and expression, wisdom and compassion, but in reality, in truth, they're indistinguishable. They're the two aspects of one and the same thing. Now, at this stage, there are two important questions for us to consider. We've spoken of an experience. We've spoken of an expression. Experience of enlightenment through wisdom. Expression of enlightenment through compassion. But the questions which arise to be considered are, first of all, the general nature of the expression in thought and speech, and the function of that expression. So the first question, as to the general nature of the expression, this amounts to asking whether the Buddha's conceptual formulation or formulations of his experience of enlightenment, cannot be all reduced to a single leading principle from which all the others could be deduced. In other words, when the Buddha preached, when the Buddha taught, he preached and he taught out of, ultimately, his experience of enlightenment. But he taught many different kinds of people, different degrees of intellectual ability, different temperaments, different difficulties, different degrees of understanding and spiritual development. So he might have taught one person in one way, taught another person in another way, presented things in one light to one kind of person, in another light to another kind of person. So all these different teachings, all these different expressions, but all ultimately stemming from the Buddha's enlightenment, all issuing from that. So the question which arises is whether all these expressions, all these teachings, cannot be reduced to one great principle from which they could all be deduced. So is there a general principle which is, as it were, a general, almost archetypal expression in terms of thought and speech on the philosophical level of the Buddha's spiritual experience, beyond which you can't get. You can't have anything more general than that. From there you'd have to go directly to the Enlightenment experience itself. So is there any such general principle or expression of the Buddha's enlightenment? Now we can say very definitely that there is. There's a principle, an expression, which is, we may say widely, universally recognized in Buddhism, in the Buddhist tradition, as being the expression, the most widely generalized expression of the Buddha's enlightenment. And this is what we call in Buddhism the law or the principle or the teaching of praticca samutpada, the law of conditionality. Now, though this is so general, though it is so fundamental, basically, like all fundamental things, it's very simple indeed. So simple we might possibly even overlook it. And the formula which is given for this expression of the Buddha's enlightenment in the scriptures is as follows. In very simple, almost abstract mathematical language, the Buddha says that it's all reducible to this. This being, that becomes. From the arising of this, that arises. This not becoming, that does not become. From the ceasing of this, that ceases. So this is the formula, in its highest degree of generality and abstractness. Let me repeat it just once more. This being, that becomes. From the arising of this, that arises. This not becoming, that does not become. From the ceasing of this, that ceases. And this law, this principle, holds good of the whole of existence, whether it's material or mental or spiritual. The same great law holds good. The law of praticca samutpada, the law of conditionality, or conditioned co-production or dependent origination, as also it is translated. And the whole of Buddhism, we may say, all this great superstructure of thought and practice is based on this formula, on this principle, the praticca samutpada, law of conditionality. I mentioned a little while ago one of the Buddha's two chief disciples, and that was Sariputra. In a sense, Sariputra is the chief disciple. He was said to be the wisest of the disciples, and the Buddha called him the Senapati, the commander-in-chief of the Sangha. The suggestion being the Sangha, the spiritual community, under its more militant aspect, is like an army. So Sariputra was called the Senapati, the commander-in-chief. And the story of his conversion to Buddhism is not only very interesting, but is associated with this teaching. You may remember I described how the Buddha went to Saranath, where his 5 former disciples were staying. He went back there after his enlightenment, gathered them round him, and he taught them. So they became enlightened. Other people came. They also became enlightened, and eventually, in a very short time, there were 60 enlightened beings in the world. And then the Buddha said to them, I am free from all bonds, human and divine. You also are free from all bonds, human and divine. Go now and teach. all beings for the benefit and the happiness of the whole world, out of compassion, out of love for all living beings, go forth and teach. So they all scattered in all directions, and they were going up and down the length and breadth of India, spreading the message, spreading the teaching of the Buddha. Now at that time we are told, in Bihar, in a little village near Nalanda, a little village which incidentally I have visited, there were two young men called Sariputta and Moggallana. And they left home, and they decided to search for the truth and to find a great enlightened teacher. So they made a pact, because they'd been very close friends since childhood, since babyhood in fact, they'd always been together. So they made a pact. And the pact was that they would go in opposite directions. And whoever found an enlightened teacher first should go and tell the other. And they'd both become his disciples together. This was their pact. So Sariputta went in one direction, and Moggallana went in the other. But Sariputta was the lucky one. He hadn't gone very far, he hadn't wandered for many weeks, before he saw someone coming in the distance who seemed, well, he hardly dared hope, but he seemed, maybe, enlightened. So he drew near, and it was Asvajit, or Asaji in Pali, one of those original 5, now wandering from place to place. And Sariputta was very impressed by his whole appearance, his whole deportment, and he put to him the question, which is the question in India, in the East. They don't ask about the weather or anything like that. He put the question, he came right to the point, he said, "Who is your teacher?" In the East, incidentally, especially in India and Tibet, everybody has a teacher, a spiritual teacher, from whom he has received some kind of initiation, some kind of religious practice. If you don't have a spiritual teacher, well, they say you hardly exist as a human being. You might just as well be a dog or a cat as be a human being and not have a spiritual teacher. So the first question is, the first thing you want to know about anybody, well, what line of spiritual practice does he belong to? So Sariputta asked Ashvajit, "Who is your teacher?" So he at once said, "Gautama, who has gone forth from the clan of the Sakyas, the enlightened one who is now the Buddha, he is my teacher." So Sariputta was overjoyed to hear this, and then he said, "But what is his teaching?" This is the second point, the second thing you want to know. What is his teaching? So Ashvajit was apparently enlightened, but he was a very modest man, and he said, "I am newly converted. I don't know much of the teaching, but what little I do know, I shall tell you." So he recited a verse which has since become famous all over the Buddhist world, all over the East. He said, and in the original it's in meter, so not in rhyme, he said, "The Tathagata," that is to say the Buddha, the Tathagata has explained the origin of those things which proceed from a cause or a condition. Their cessation too he has explained. This is the doctrine of the great Shramana. Doctrine here, Dharma. This is the Dharma of the great Shramana, the great ascetic, the great renunciant. So much. That was all. But when Sariputta heard this verse, his whole sort of being rose up as a sort of flash of insight, and he said, "Well, this is the truth. Whatever arises in dependence on conditions. When those conditions are there no longer, cease." He saw this, and he at once became what we call a stream entrant. He entered the stream, leading ultimately to liberation. And he became a disciple of the Buddha, became the chief disciple. And this great verse we find, as I said, all over the Buddhist world. You can find it in India, stamped on the base of images. You can find it on clay seals in the ruins of monasteries, hundreds and thousands of little clay seals just stamped with this verse. Find it in China, you find it in Tibet. In Tibet, when they consecrate a Buddha image, very often they print hundreds of thousands of little copies of this verse, and they stuff them all inside the image. And this is one way of consecrating an image. So this verse is really, you may say, basic Buddhism. On the doctrinal level, there's nothing more basic than this. This is common ground to all the Buddhist schools, whether it's the Buddhism of Ceylon, or the Buddhism of Tibet, or the Buddhism of China or Japan, whether it's Theravada or Mahayana or Zen or Tibetan Buddhism, it all comes back to this. Sooner or later you come back to this. Praticca samutpada, conditioned co-production, the great law of conditionality. If one wants any further proof or evidence of the importance of this great teaching, of the fact that it is the most highly generalized expression of the Buddha's experience of enlightenment, then one can turn to the Arya Pariyesana Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. This is a sort of autobiographical discourse. There are several of them in the Pali Canon, and they're very, very interesting. The Buddha, as an old man to a monk, just relates some of the experiences of his younger days, how he practiced asceticism, how he gained enlightenment, about his thoughts and doubts, about preaching the doctrine, and so on. All in this Arya Pariyesana Sutta, the Sutta or the discourse on the noble quest. So here, the Buddha relates the story of how after his enlightenment, he wasn't quite sure whether to preach or not, whether to make known the truth he had discovered or not. And the text represents him as reflecting in this way, as saying to himself, I have gained this Dharma. You notice the word Dharma is used. Here it means, of course, truth, law, principle, reality. I have gained this Dharma, which is profound, hard to perceive, hard to know, tranquil, transcendent, beyond the sphere of reasoning, subtle, to be known only by the wise. And then he went on to reflect, mankind is intent on its attachments, and takes delight and pleasure in them. For mankind, intent on its attachments, it is hard to see this Dharma, namely, conditionedness, origination by way of cause, paticca samuppada. In other words, when the Buddha was reflecting by himself, and as he was saying to himself, well, it's difficult for humanity to understand what I have discovered. And what have I discovered? What Dharma, what truth, what reality? Conditioned co-production, conditionality, universal conditionality. So this also goes to show that this is the first, the most highly generalized presentation of the Buddha's insight. As if to say that when the mind is enlightened, and when it looks out, when the enlightened mind looks out at all existence, at the whole of the phenomenal universe, what is the first thing that strikes it? What is the most obvious thing about it? That it's all conditioned, arises in dependence on conditions, and when those conditions cease, disappears. So this is the basic insight, as it were, so far as the world is concerned, from the standpoint of enlightenment. Now, even though the importance of this praticca samutpada, this law of conditionality, that everything arises in dependence on conditions and ceases when the conditions cease, though the importance of this principle, this formulation, this expression of the Buddha's experience of enlightenment is agreed upon, is accepted on all sides by everybody, every Buddhist, its meaning is not always clearly understood. So let's just go a little into this. We say conditionality. But there isn't just one kind of conditionality. There are two kinds of conditionality. Two ways, as it were, in which things can arise, experiences, states can arise, independent upon causes and conditions. So what are these two kinds of conditionality? Here again we come on to familiar ground for many of us, but it's worth considering over again because it's of fundamental importance, and we shall find it recurring in one form or under one aspect or another in practically all our talks, in all our studies of the Buddha's teaching. The first type of conditionality is what we call cyclical between opposites. When you sway backwards and forwards between opposites. In dependence upon pleasure, there arises pain. In dependence upon loss, there arises gain. In dependence upon gain, loss. In dependence upon winter, summer. In dependence upon summer, winter. The play of the opposites. The cyclical process, about which I said something last Sunday in one of the talks at our seminar. So this is the cyclical type of conditionality. Now, the other type of conditionality is not cyclical, but as it were spiral, not between opposites, but between factors which progressively augment each other. So that in dependence upon, say, A, you don't get arising a factor which negates A, as when, say, loss arises in dependence upon gain. You get the arising of a factor which augments A, which is A plus, or A1, and then A2 and A3, and so on to infinity. As when in dependence upon, say, happiness, you get joy. In dependence upon joy, bliss. In dependence upon bliss, rapture. In dependence upon rapture, ecstasy. This is the progressive spiral series, as it were, in which you don't get a reaction to the opposite. So these are the two basic types or kinds of conditionality at work in the universe, at all levels. The cyclical and the spiral. Now, in traditional terms, the whole process of cyclical action and reaction, the cyclical type of conditionality, in traditional language, this can be called the round of existence, or the wheel of life, with its process of karma and rebirth. If we look at a picture of the wheel of life, this is a detailed presentation of the whole cyclical mode of conditionality and of existence, sentient existence, as involved in the cyclical process, undergoing the cyclical process. Reacting, acting and reacting between the pairs of opposites, going up and down, round and round, in accordance with the law of karma and rebirth, by means of the 12 nidanas, or links, as they're called. There's no time to go into this in this talk. Now, the second type of conditionality, the spiral, this is represented traditionally not by the round, but by what leads out of the round, out of the wheel of life, away from the wheel of life, represented by the path culminating in nirvana, represented by the 8 angas of the Noble Eightfold Path, represented by the 7 bodhyangas, or limbs of enlightenment, about which I spoke yesterday. The path, essentially, the path of the spiritual life, represents the embodiment in terms of our own life and experience of this progressive spiral type of conditionality. Now, the first type of conditionality, the cyclical, that's symbolized by the round, the wheel of life, is covered by the first and second of the noble truths, the truth of suffering and the truth of the cause of suffering, which is craving. So here you get a reversal. You get the reaction first and then the action, the effect and then the cause. So instead of suffering craving. You can also put it as craving, suffering. This is the action and reaction, as it were. So the first and second of the Noble Truths, the Four Noble Truths, represent the cyclical type of conditionality, represent in another, as it were, abbreviated form, the round of existence, the wheel of life. And the third and the fourth Noble Truths, that is to say, the truth of the cessation of suffering and the way leading to the cessation of suffering, these represent the spiral process. Again, you have to reverse, because the cessation of suffering is nirvana, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering, that is the path. So the cessation of suffering, nirvana, is the culmination of the path. So again, reverse, and you get the cyclical process. So the third and fourth of the Noble Truths represent the spiral modal type of conditionality. Now, there's no time to go into all this in detail, sufficient to just give the general outline, and those who have been with us for some time, they do know, in any case, all these things in sufficient detail. But let's just bear in mind that there are these two kinds or types of conditionality at work in the universe. The cyclical, acting and reacting between factors which are pairs of opposites, and the spiral, going, as it were, from perfection to perfection. Now, so much for the general nature of Dharma as expression. It's basically the law of conditioned co-production, conditionality in these two forms. What about the purpose, the function of the expression? Why is there the Dharma? Why does the Dharma exist? Why did the Buddha express it at all? Why do we have the teaching of conditioned co-production, universal conditionality, and all the other teachings? Now, the function of the Dharma, the function of the Buddha's teaching, is made clear by the Buddha himself in what is called the parable of the raft. And we can't remember this, we can't think about this too often or too much. The Buddha said, under the symbol or under the figure of a raft, do I preach the Dharma, or do I make known the Dharma? How is that so? He said, supposing a man was to come to the edge of a great stretch of water, a great river, supposing he wanted to get to the other shore, the opposite bank, but there was no ferry, no one to take him across, what would he do? He'd chop down a few saplings, he'd lash them together, he'd make a raft. He'd sit on the raft, and using hands and feet to paddle, he'd get across to the other side. He'd cross to the other shore. So the Buddha put the question, well, having arrived at the other shore, what would he do with the raft? Would he? Yes, he'd throw it away, of course he would. He wouldn't, out of gratitude, thinking how useful it had been, he wouldn't load it onto his shoulders and continue his journey with the raft. He'd just leave it where it was. So in the same way, the Buddha said, the Dharma, my teaching, is a means to an end. It's a raft to take you to the other shore of nirvana. It's not an end in itself. It's the means to enlightenment. This is what the Dharma essentially is. This is its function, to be a means for men and women to gain enlightenment. And here, therefore, there are two extremes with regard to the Dharma, two extremes with regard to the raft, to be avoided. One extreme, of course, is walking up and down this shore, saying, oh, what a beautiful raft. Oh, how lovely. But you continue walking up and down, or you sit on this shore and you admire the raft. You never think of making any use of it. Or you start disputing about it. You say, no, I think the raft isn't very well made. I think there ought to be 10 saplings, not 12. And I think it ought to be lashed together a bit more securely. And I don't quite like the way it floats in the water. I'd build it bigger and better. But you remain sitting on the bank, and you speculate, and you dispute, and you discuss about the raft. So this is one extreme. The other extreme, of course, is to get onto the raft and go across to the other shore. But then you get stuck with the raft, and you sit down and you say, well, the raft is the thing, after it's brought me here, and you insist on continuing your journey bearing the raft. Now, both these attitudes are ridiculous. Most people, of course, are more likely to be guilty of the first, of walking up and down this shore, looking at the raft, possibly, admiring it, talking about it, but never actually getting onto it. Now, this parable of the raft gives us a very good guide. It gives us a very good criterion. It makes it absolutely clear that the Dharma, or rather the function of the Dharma, is to carry us across, is to help us spiritually progress. We can even go further than this, as we shall see a little later on, that the Dharma is that which helps us to progress spiritually, that which takes us a little way up the spiral. This is the Dharma. We find that the great Emperor Ashoka, who lived 2.5 centuries after the Buddha, inscribed in his rock edicts this memorable saying, "Whatever the Buddha said was well said." But we find the Mahayana Sutras, which may have been written down a little later than that, reversing this. And they say, whatever is well said, that is the word of the Buddha. In other words, whatever helps you across, whatever helps you up that spiral, take it as the Dharma. Take it as the word of the Buddha. Because that's all that the word of the Buddha, all that the Dharma is, that which helps you across, that which helps you on your journey. That's why it's ridiculous to say, as sometimes you hear people saying, well, such and such practice helps me in my Buddhist life very much. I feel much better for it. It helps me concentrate. But of course, it isn't anything to do with Buddhism. It isn't part of the Dharma. But if it helps you spiritually, it is essentially, in principle, part of the Dharma. So we may say that whatever leads to enlightenment, whatever helps us in that direction, whatever helps man to evolve, this is the Dharma. And this is exactly what the Buddha said, in so many words, to his aunt and foster mother, Mahaprajapati Gautami. Some of you know the story. You know that the Buddha's own mother died when he was 7 days old. He was reared by his mother's sister, his aunt, who was also his father's wife. And you know that after the Buddha became enlightened, she and a number of other women followed him. And at Ananda's intercession, they were ordained as nuns. But one day, many years later, Mahaprajapati Gautami, the aunt of the Buddha, came to him rather upset and rather disturbed. She said, "Lord, I don't know what to think." So the Buddha said, I'm paraphrasing it a little, the Buddha said, "Well, what's the matter, auntie?" So she said, "It's those disciples of yours." So the Buddha said, "Well, what have they done now?" So she said, "I don't know what to make of this teaching of yours. I've heard so many of your disciples, but they all seem to give a different version. Some say you teach this, others say you teach that. I don't know what to think. So how am I to know? How am I to know which is really your teaching? They're all teaching in your name. They all say that this is what you say. They're very sure about that. But they all seem to differ. So how am I to know what is your teaching? What is your Dharma?" So this is the question put by the Buddha's own aunt to the Buddha himself. And the Pali scriptures record the Buddha's reply. He says, "Don't worry." He said, "Take it like this. Whatever you find in practice conduces to peace of mind, conduces to purity, conduces to seclusion, conduces to fewness of desires, conduces to contentment, conduces to insight and wisdom and detachment from the world, conduces to an understanding of the transcendental. Whatever you find in your own experience conduces to these ends, take that as my Dharma. Take that as my teaching." This is the principle, this is the guideline that the Buddha himself gives. The test, the criterion, is in practice. As we say in English, colloquially, I hope not too colloquially for this context, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if only we remember that simple principle in dealing with Buddhism, it saves us a lot of fuss and bother. We've got many forms of Buddhism now in the world, in the Buddhist world. Buddhism is a very old religion. It's been going on for 2,500 years. It's spread to all sorts of countries of the East. It's spread to the snowy tablelands of Tibet, the sweltering jungles of Southeast Asia, the beautiful islands of Japan, the deserts of Central Asia, the subtropical plains of India. It's spread to all these places, and everywhere it's changed in accordance with local conditions. So we get all sorts of forms, all sorts of presentations of Buddhism. And sometimes it happens that we unfortunate people in the West, we're deluged with all sorts of conflicting presentations of Buddhism. One Buddhist school says Buddhism is this, another says it's that. One school says, as I point out sometimes, rely on your own efforts. Only you can do it. It's up to you. No one can help you. No God, no Buddha, nobody. Another school comes along and says, you can do nothing. Only the Buddha Amitabha can do it for you. You rely upon him. Trust in him. He's done it already, in fact. You just have to accept that. Completely different point of view, apparently. So we get all these conflicting presentations, all these conflicting interpretations. So we are very much in the position of the Buddha's aunt. We don't know what to think sometimes, all these conflicting presentations and expositions of disciples. So let us remember what the Buddha said to his aunt. It's my Dharma, it's my teaching if it works. If you find in your own spiritual life, your own spiritual experience, that it helps you become more concentrated, more kind, more sensitive, more intelligent, wiser, more understanding. If you find that the teaching helps you in this way, well, this is the Dharma. This is the true teaching. This is what the Buddha really taught and really meant. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If we want to know, if we want to be sure, whether any form of Buddhism, whether it's Theravada or Tibetan Buddhism, Kagyupa, Nyingmapa, Sakyapa, Tendai, Shin, Zen, if we want to know whether it's really authentic, whether it's really Buddhist in the true sense, then we have to ask ourselves the question, does it really help people to become enlightened? Does it really still continue to produce enlightened beings? Or is it a venerable museum piece? Very ancient, very beautiful, very admirable, but for the museum and not for life. We have to ask ourselves this question. Because it's only Dharma, it's only really the Buddha's teaching, if it's alive, and if it works, and if it still helps people to follow the spiral and to follow the process of the higher evolution. Only then is it the Dharma. We must resist the temptation to think that the Dharma is this or the Dharma is that, this teaching or that teaching. Provisionally, that may be true, but not in the long run, not ultimately. In Christianity, we're familiar with creedal statements. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and so on. Christianity is tied down there in these creedal formulations, but not in Buddhism. There are formulations, there are presentations, but they're all provisional. They're all pointers. As one of the sutras says, it's all a finger pointing to the moon. We saw the full moon last night, at least I hope we did. And if you point it out to someone, you use your finger. But sometimes, instead of looking at the moon, he keeps his eyes fixed on your finger and never goes from the finger to the moon. So it's just like that with many of these teachings. The teachings all point to enlightenment. But people never think of enlightenment. They fasten on the finger, they fasten on the teaching. And never think it's a means to an end, a means for indicating the state of enlightenment. So these are the sort of things that we have to consider. These are the sort of things that we have to bear in mind. Now in this country, we're in process of introducing Buddhism, the Dharma, the Buddhist spiritual tradition, Buddhist spiritual life. But I think we may say that Buddhism in this country, as and when it develops, is very unlikely to follow any existing Buddhist pattern, because our needs, our approach, our background in this country are different from those of any Eastern country. What we have to do in this country is to draw upon the essence, the inner spirit of the Buddha's teaching, as preserved in all schools, take the best, not just in the eclectic sort of way, not just intellectually, but draw upon them deeply and spiritually, and unite and blend them all into one great stream of spiritual tradition adapted to the needs of people in this country. This is really the task which is before us. It isn't very easy to do. It's something which will demand a great deal of effort and spiritual experience on our part. It's a very vast subject, incidentally. I don't want to touch upon it really this morning. But let us bear it in mind that the Dharma really represents not this doctrine, not that teaching, but a great current of spiritual life in which we can participate, in which we can help others to share, and which sweeps us on, bears us on at any rate, eventually in the direction of enlightenment, in the direction of nirvana. Now let me, before we close, just briefly recapitulate the main points of this talk. First of all, the Buddha's Dharma is the expression on the conceptual level, in terms of thought and speech, of his experience of reality, enlightenment. Secondly, this expression, the Dharma, consists fundamentally of the teaching of praticca samutpada, universal conditionality, in its two forms, the cyclical and the spiral, or the round and the path. And thirdly, that the function of the Dharma, the function of this expression, as illustrated by the parable of the raft, is to act as a means to enlightenment. Its sanction is pragmatic. And fourthly, whatever helps us gain enlightenment, whatever helps us to progress spiritually, whatever helps make us morally and spiritually more perfect, is to be regarded as being really a part or aspect of the Dharma in which we take refuge. And fifthly, we recollect that in this country, the Buddhist movement, which is now growing and developing here, will be applying all these principles not only vigorously, but even rigorously. So if we understand all this, we shall be able ourselves to take refuge in the Dharma. We shall be able to board that raft, to do a little paddling, perhaps hoist a little sail to catch the breeze, and eventually, we hope, not alone but with others on that raft, cross to the other shore.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.